We've read in previous weeks about how God delivered the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt where they were slaves, and how He led them into the wilderness on their way to the promised land that He had promised to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And now we find them in the wilderness, and they're traveling and they're following this pillar of smoke that's before them. God dwelling in that pillar of smoke during the day, and in the nighttime it's a pillar of fire, and wherever that pillar moves, that's where they go.
Come on, Zach.
And when the pillar stops, they stop and make camp there. God leading them through this wilderness. But God told Moses that wherever that pillar would stop, that is where God wanted His own tent set up. That's where God wanted His dwelling place set up. And that's what they call the tabernacle. See, the tabernacle, as we read through the last part of the book of Exodus here, it was built to God's own specifications.
Yeah.
God told Moses exactly how He wanted everything done.
You're right.
Down to the dimensions of the tent, down to the materials that would be made, that would be used to make the tent, and the instruments inside the tent, and the furniture inside of it. Told Him exactly how He wanted it made. And this tabernacle would be God's dwelling place. It would be where God lived, where they would go and they would make sacrifices and that they would commune with God. And this would be His dwelling place for more than 1,000 years. Until God blessed Solomon to build the temple in Jerusalem. This is where this was the center of worship for these people.
You're right, Zach.
It was not just the center of worship, it was the place where God physically dwelt. Where you could go and you knew God would be there.
Yes.
So I won't read the text this morning, but I want to talk to you about the tabernacle. Because we've all probably got an idea of how it looked in our mind. But by reading these scriptures, we can put together a mental image. First of all, let's imagine the surroundings. The wilderness. The desert place. We've all seen deserts. We've seen what they look like. Not a lot going on. Mostly flat. A mountain here or there, but mostly barren. A little scrub brush here or there.
Right,
mostly sand. Mostly nothing. So you imagine as you're traveling, maybe you see this structure on the horizon. It's a big tent. And it was covered, it had, the walls were made of goat skins, but it was covered in ram skins that were dyed red. So it stood out. And as you approached, the tabernacle was set apart from everything else. It was surrounded by a fence that God specified Moses build, made of fabric. And so you would have the tabernacle, and then surrounded on all four sides, you would have this fence that separated the house of God, the dwelling place of God, from everybody else. As you would enter the courtyard, it was always the gate to the courtyard was always facing east, always facing toward the place they were going. As you would enter the courtyard, the first thing you would come to would be an altar. And this was the altar where the priests, when it would be that time that they would make sacrifices, they would bring the animals and they would slay them, and they would put them on this altar right in the front of the courtyard, and that's where they would burn the animals and cook the animals as a commemoration to God. And as we walk past this altar, we come to a laver, like a bird bath almost, a stand with a bowl on top, and that's where the water was held. That's where the priests would purify themselves before they went into the tent. So we go inside the tent, and you can imagine it was a fairly sizable structure with this great beautiful red leather roof and these goatskin curtains. You would maybe pull back the opening and walk in, and you would see a couple pieces of furniture. There would be a lampstand with seven candles on it, built to God's own specifications.
Yes, sir. You're right.
You would see a table with 12 loaves of bread on it, one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. This was sacrificial bread that was used in the priest's sacrifices to God. There would be another altar where they would burn the incense, and it would. You can imagine how this tent would smell. It would be a sweet fragrance. People, to be honest, didn't smell very good in those days.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
They hadn't developed modern shampoos and Dove bar soap and Old Spice deodorant. People, and they walked around with a bunch of livestock. And Chris and Lee, I know you all are well familiar with the smell of livestock.
Oh, yeah.
And if you're living around them and working around them, you're not going to smell very good. But the temple not only looked unlike anything else, it smelled good. Incense burning before God all the time.
Come on, Zach.
But as you passed all this furniture, there was another curtain inside the tabernacle. And it was curtained off into a square. And that was called the Holy of Holies.
Come on.
And this was a special place. I told you that the tabernacle was where God dwelled, but the Holy of Holies, it was partitioned off from the rest of the tabernacle because that was where the Spirit of God was so physically present that to enter into that place, you had to make sure that you were without spot and you were without blemish. It was a place only the high priest could go.
Come on.
And even the high priest, even though he was the chief religious official in those days, even before he went in there, he had to make sacrifices for himself.
Sure did.
Before he could go into the Holy of Holies and offer sin sacrifices for the rest of the people.
Yes.
And it was such a grave thing that if you went in there and you didn't have things squared up, the Spirit of God would kill you.
Come on.
That's how powerful it was in this place.
Yes.
And it was such that when God told Moses, He even told Moses what the priest's clothes should look like.
Yes.
He specified that there would be bells on their clothing, so when the people outside would hear them moving, they would know the priest was okay. They even wore a cord on them so that if something should happen to them, if God should strike them down, they'd be able to pull them out of there without sending other people in and they dying too. But it was in this Holy of Holies that a very special piece of furniture dwelled. The Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah.
We know all about it. We've read all about it and how the children of Israel would go before it, and every time it would go before them, they would win whatever battle it came upon them. The Ark of the Covenant was, despite what Indiana Jones portrayed it as,
Right. Come on.
it was a wooden box. It was covered in gold. And on top of that was something called the mercy seat. It was a seat, and it was flanked on each side by golden cherubims. God specified that this is how it would be built. And because the Spirit of God was so present on this Ark of the Covenant, you were not supposed to touch it. So on the sides, there were golden rings through which would be placed wooden rods, and that is how they would carry it. They would get priests, the sons of the Levites, they would get them on either side, and they would lift this thing, and that's how they would carry it. I'm sure it was... Man has over the years, we've seen paintings and drawings, and people have interpreted what it looked like. And I'm sure it was beautiful. But what was most important about the Ark of the Covenant was what was inside of it.
Yes.
As we read through Exodus, there were 3 artifacts kept in that Ark of the Covenant. There was Aaron's rod. There was a golden pot with manna in it. and there were those stone tablets that God Himself had inscribed with the Ten Commandments.
Right.
Each of these things had a story. We see the ark mostly referred to as the Ark of the Covenant. And Indiana Jones, as I mentioned, they call it the Lost Ark. But my favorite name for it in the Bible is the Ark of the Testimony.
Amen.
Amen.
So why Aaron's rod? Why the pot of manna? Why the tablets with the Ten Commandments? Of all the things they could have put in there, why those? It's because they were testimonies.
Come on, Zack.
See, an ark is just a vessel. We think of Noah's ark. An ark is something that you put things in to deliver safely from one place to another.
You're right, Zack.
We think of the ark that Noah built, and God commanded all the animals to go and to enter in, and then He shut the door, and it was that ark that preserved Noah and his family from the flood. We think of, there was another ark in Moses' story. He was placed in an ark in the river and floated to where Pharaoh's daughter would pluck him out of the river. It was a vessel that delivered cargo from one place to another. And although the ark sometimes has become an object of desire, and people have sought to find it and believe that it held great power, the power was not necessarily in the ark itself, because the ark was just a vessel.
It was a possession.
It was the testimonies inside.
Come on, Zack.
So I want to talk to you about the testimonies this morning. One of the things that God told Moses to put in the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of the Testimony, was manna. And anybody that has been saved very long, or has read the Bible very long, or attended Sunday school when you were a little kid, you know the story of the manna. When God had delivered the people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt, they went into a wilderness place. And we talked about what the wilderness looked like. There wasn't a whole lot that lived out there. There wasn't a whole lot of food to be found.
Come on.
And they cried unto God. They were worried that they would die. They were hungry.
You're right, Zack.
And even though God had delivered them from Egypt, and they should have had enough faith to know that, Lord, if He brought us out of that,
Yes.
He'll take us where He says He's going. They murmured before God. Does that sound familiar?
Yes.
Sounds familiar to me. But God, being compassionate toward them, decided that every morning when they got up, and the dew would be on the ground, there would be bread on the ground too.
Yeah.
And that they could go out and they could collect. Every family, they could collect just as much as they needed for that day. And on the day before the Sabbath, they were to collect twice as much, because He didn't want them collecting on the Sabbath. But you know what? If it had been me and I walked out that first morning and there was bread all over the ground, I would say, oh, bring me some extra baskets. I would want to collect just as much as I can, because this is a miraculous thing, but what if it's not here tomorrow? God told them to only collect as much as they needed, because He wanted to remind them every day that when they went out, the food was there.
Come on.
Yeah.
I'm going to take care of your needs, not just today, not just tomorrow, but the next day, and the next day, and the next day. And David, when we can read in Psalms, when David was talking about the travels of the children of Israel, he said the manna was still in their mouths, and they were already doubting God. But the manna kept coming. God kept providing. God kept giving this food.
Sure.
So at some point, somebody decided they would keep a little bit of this. Moses got him a golden pot
Come on,
and
son.
filled it with manna. And he put that golden pot in this Ark of the Covenant, Ark of the Testimony, as a reminder that even in the most barren desert, even in the most hopeless situation,
Zack.
God would hear their cries.
Yes.
And God would meet their needs.
Oh, yes.
He would fill their bellies and preserve their lives. Another artifact that was kept in that Ark of the Covenant was a rod that Aaron had. And this is an artifact that goes back to the very beginning of Israel's journey out of the land of Egypt. You'll recall that Pharaoh one time called Moses and Aaron before him.
Come on, Zach.
And Pharaoh wanted them to show, he said, if this God of yours that you're saying is going to deliver you, if he's real, I want to see a miracle. So Aaron cast that rod that he had in his hand, just a walking stick, commonplace in those days, nothing special, everybody had one. Cast it down, and it became a serpent.
Yeah.
And Pharaoh's magicians said, we can do that too. And they threw their rods down, and they became serpents. But then Aaron's rod, still being a serpent, gobbled up all the other rods. And Aaron grabbed it by the tail, and it was a stick again. God showed Pharaoh his power
Come on.
through that rod. But later, while they were in the wilderness, and they were murmuring against God and against Moses and against Aaron, some people decided that they could run the church just a little bit better than the preacher.
Come on.
So this man named Korah got him some followers together. And he raised up a rebellion against Moses and Aaron. And he took over the services to God. And this vexed Moses and it vexed Aaron. And it bothered God. So God caused the ground to open up and to swallow all these people that had followed Korah. But God knew that there was still some doubt among the children of Israel. There was still, some of their hearts weren't completely invested. God had chosen Moses. God had chosen Aaron to lead the people.
Yes.
And God wanted to show, He wanted to put His stamp of approval on these men that He had chosen. So there would be no doubt that this is who He had picked to lead the children of Israel. So God said, Moses, I'll tell you what you do. He said, I want you to get a rod from each of the 12 tribes. And He said, whoever's rod I choose, that's who's going to run the temple. That's who's going to
Come on, Zach.
who's going to be in charge of the services before me. So Moses collected these rods and Aaron gave him his. And they put it in a tent. And the next day they came back. And that old piece of wood, that old dead branch that Aaron, Lord, had probably just picked up on the side of the way somewhere. He'd had it for years. Dry, probably cracked. That rod had bloomed. That rod had brought forth life. And not only that, it had produced fruit. It had there were almonds hanging off of it when Moses went to get it. And that was God's sign that Aaron and his sons were to be the ones that would be the priests before him. So Moses put that in the Ark of the Covenant too. For a couple reasons. It showed that God would protect His people. A rod was something that you used to protect yourself. It wasn't just a walking stick. It was something that if something would come against you in the wilderness, that was your line of protection. That was the weapon that you had in your hand all the time. It showed that God would protect His people from anything. Whether it was an outside force like the armies of the Egyptians and Pharaoh, or if it was something that come from the inside like Korah and his followers. God would preserve that which He had chosen. He would protect it. But it also showed that in God's hands, anything, even the oldest, deadest piece of wood,
You're right.
God could bring forth new life.
New life, yes.
And the final thing that God told Moses to put in that ark were the tablets. We've seen paintings of this too, where Moses came off the mountain and he's carrying these 2 stone tablets that he had hewn and he had taken on the mountain at Sinai, and God Himself with His finger had written these words.
Yes.
Amen.
You're right.
Contained the rules to live by. There were books and books of laws that God gave the children of Israel, but they all went back to these 10. They were rules for how to respect God
Come on, Zach.
and for rules to respect each other.
Come on.
If you think about it, the commandments can be divided into two parts. We think of them as a list of rules that, you know, if you mess up, it's like in school, you go write your name on the board or something. But they're rules. You look at them, they're divided. They're rules to love God and then rules to love other people.
Yes.
And it was these rules that God knew that if they followed these things, everything, their lives would be fine. Their lives, they would get along just fine. It was a law not just for God's sake, it was a law for their sake.
Yes.
But it was also, in addition to a list of rules, it was a written contract between the people and God. See, up to this point, the covenant between God and the children of Israel had been a spoken promise, but now it was in writing.
Yeah.
It was a document that said, if you follow these things, if you abide by these ordinances, you are going to be my people, and I'm going to be your God, and I'm going to show mercy to you, and I'm going to take care of it. And when Moses, we know the story when Moses came off the mountain and broke those tablets because he saw that the people, while he had just been gone a couple days, the people had already created a graven image and were worshiping that instead of God. Moses broke the tablets. He was so mad, and God told him to go back on the mountain, get him 2 more tablets. He wrote it again, exactly the same way. It was a testimony that God's rules aren't going to change.
Yes.
That if you abide by these rules, God would take care of His people. And it's worthy to note, they had paper. They had ink. It was written in stone.
Stone, yes. Forever and ever.
The ark was the center of the tabernacle. The ark was the center of the Holy of Holies, and the Holy of Holies was the center of the tabernacle. The tabernacle was the center of that courtyard. And then that courtyard where the tabernacle lived, it was the center of their camps. So if you want to think about it, everything that they did, every camp that they set up were based around these 3 testimonies. Wherever they traveled, the ark went first.
Yes.
The testimonies inside the ark went
Yeah.
first. No matter what battle they came upon, no matter who they were up against, the testimonies went before the army.
Yes.
There's an easy, good reason for that. When the enemy comes against you, a testimony is a very good weapon.
Yes.
We listened to testimonies this morning. Timmy talking about how God had worked things out at his work. Omer talking about how God had helped him get that side-by-side out of the woods. And so many others. I can't even think. I was trying to make a mental list this morning. Kinky with his blood sugar. I was trying to make a mental list because I knew I would be talking about testimonies, but eventually there were too many for me to remember. But testimonies, it's good that we have those. It's good that we keep those. It was one thing for Moses and his people to say, well, do you remember when God sent us manna? But no, they had kept some of it and they had it there to look at and to remind them. So that when something came up against them, because they faced so many battles and so many obstacles in the wilderness, when something came up against us, they were able to look at those testimonies and say, God brought us through then, and He'll bring us through now.
Come on, Zack.
So what about our collection of testimonies? That's what I want to leave you with this morning. That tabernacle, if you think about it, was just a structure of skin. The walls were goat skin.
Yep.
The roof was ram skin.
Come on.
It was a house of flesh.
Yes.
And inside that house dwelled God. And that's just the same as us this morning. Those who have accepted Christ in our lives, God lives in us, in the center of us, in that Holy of Holies inside our heart.
Yes.
But that's not complete if you don't collect a couple of testimonies along the way.
Come on, Zack.
You might not have bread from heaven. I don't. God's never had to meet my needs that way. I don't have a rod that brought forth almonds, and I sure don't have tablets of stone that were inscribed by God's own hand. But as we walk through our Christian lives and God delivers us from things that would surely have destroyed us, it's important that we collect testimonies. That we keep them in this ark of ours. That when things come against us, we'll be able to look back like the children of Israel and say, God met my needs then, and He's the same God, and He'll meet my needs now. Let me tell you about my ark. Let me tell you about my testimonies. There was a time, and it wasn't anything special, but there was a time when it was when I was in high school. I got to school, and I suddenly became so ill. I don't think I've ever felt, when I had the flu or something else, I don't even think I felt more ill. It was so bad that I even began to pass out. And it was just something minor. It just came upon me all at once. And I still to this day don't know what it was, but I was with some people and they prayed for me. And it was instantly, almost after that, I felt this warm touch. And I can't explain it. I don't know what happened, but I felt a warmth coming from inside of me, radiating outward.
Come on, Zack.
And I just knew that I was fine. I don't understand what happened. I don't know what kind of sickness I had, and I can't even fully explain what happened to what that warmth was, but I am sure it was God. And when I am sick in my body now, I think about that time and I think that He healed me then. Even though it was something minor, He can heal me again.
Amen.
And I lived for 23 years with a testimony of God's healing. Of deaf ears that were unstopped. Of insurmountable odds that God beat, because that's what He does.
Yes, sir.
And there are other testimonies in my life. I could spend up here all this morning. There were times that He's intervened in my life, met my needs at work or at home. Even if it's like Toby with his grinder. There are bolts that I couldn't loosen, and I prayed. There were such minor things. They're all in this ark of my testimony that I have. There were storms, physical, literal storms I remember being afraid of.
Amen.
Hearing the wind and the rain and being physically really afraid. And I would pray and it just seemed like they would pass over. Or that even if the storm didn't pass over, the next morning you would get up and not a branch would be out of place. Nothing, not even a trash can would be knocked over. And you knew that God had protected you. There are so many testimonies that I could tell you about that I keep in this Ark of the Covenant. So when new battles arise, when I experience something new, I can look at those things.
Yes.
We're all arks of
Yes, we
testimony.
are. Yeah, Zack.
We hold God's stories of God's goodness, God's protection, God's strength. And it's important to remember those things. You think sometimes that things are so small and so silly, but folks, I have your testimonies in my Ark of the Covenant. I hear your stories of how God has protected you and delivered you. And I keep those for my own good too. I get a little bit of your manna and I put them in there too, so that when maybe I face that same battle later, I'll know that God was good for you and He's God. He'll be good for me. If there's one lesson we can learn from the Old Testament, it's that if God makes a promise, He's going to keep it.
Absolutely.
You're right.
It's that if God gives you a testimony, and you let that testimony lead,
Come on, Zack.
there's not an army formed against you that can stand. The children of Israel faced time and time again insurmountable odds.
Yes,
And it
they
feels
did.
like we do the same. It feels like the enemy is too big. It feels like the
Yes.
problem is too great.
Yes.
But if that testimony, each time that testimony went before them, they were victorious. You can even read times when other people, other armies had control of that Ark of the Covenant. The testimonies of God were so powerful that when those testimonies went before them, their houses were blessed and their armies were strengthened. So as we close this quarterly this morning, I want to tell you that if God has promised, He'll keep that promise.
Yes, He will.
And then if you have a testimony, remember those times that He keeps
Yes.
those promises.
Bless you,
Remember
Zach.
those needs that He's met.
Bless you,
Remember
Zach.
those testimonies. Hide them away because you're going to need them.
Yes.
As long as you have them, no matter what the trouble is, no matter what the
Yes,
problem is,
yes.
the victory's already been signed.